Whatever your political orientation, the phenomenon of mass migration, especially the massive movement of persons from the global south to Europe and North America, has to be reckoned as one of the great historical developments of our era. As Europe's demographic death spiral continues relatively unabated, accompanied with a fall in purchasing power and rising crime, the political class will increasingly pretend to be on the side of people's frustration. One of the best recent examples is UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Brexit was used for that purpose, to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders.
Let's be clear, are you promising today that net migration will fall every year between now and the next election, come what may?
Well, I'm promising it will fall significantly. And I do want to get it down by the end of this Parliament significantly.
What's interesting about this, and what makes Starmer a particularly exemplary case of elite strategy, is that just as he's saying these things, nearly the same sentiments would get ordinary British citizens classified as extremists, radical, even as terrorists by his government. We have a report from The Telegraph, according to which the UK government's counter-extremism program, PREVENT, has instructed Home Office civil servants to treat cultural nationalism as an extreme right-wing terrorist ideology, by which they mean the idea that, quote, Western culture is under threat from mass migration and a lack of integration by certain ethnic and cultural groups, end quote. This is similar to an equivalence in other European countries. The guidelines have faced some backlash, which maybe will lead to their being revised. More recently, however, the UK announced the creation of a detective unit called the National Internet Intelligence Investigations Team to be tasked with monitoring social media for anti-migrant posts. It's meant to provide local police with real-time intel on wrongthink, basically. Starmer says what his government makes sure ordinary persons don't get to. Discourse from the top will increasingly provide people with an escape valve for their frustrations, trying to get the population to think its grievances are being addressed, even as the establishment continues along the same course. As a civilization, an international system structures itself in terms of core and periphery, where the periphery is a source of cheap labor, its political class will be incentivized to displace the native workforce, which has a higher salary expectation, and so on, and therefore is going to create alienation, rebelliousness, nativism among that workforce. So typically what happens, and what's been happening in the West, is that to offset that rebelliousness, you present people with an impending threat that requires they fall in line. So there's always some crisis. We have a politics of perpetual crisis. Climate change, the pandemic, you name it. But if you lose credibility, if people don't take that seriously anymore, you have to pretend to accommodate their grievances, rhetorically at least, and at the same time work to repress them in other ways. And this has happened before. German Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2010 and UK Prime Minister David Cameron in early 2011 famously declared multiculturalism a failure. There was a lot of excitement back then, but neither country weaned itself off its addiction to low-wage foreign workers. In fact, the period following 2010 saw a sharp increase of asylum seekers coming into Europe. And we saw this again post-2020 with a spike in immigration from non-EU countries between 21 and 22, but even if migration slows, European birth rates are below replacement in every country, with fertility still falling. People dissatisfied with this will need to be silenced because the political order cannot reverse it. Even politicians whose entire platform centered on immigration, like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, have accepted the status quo and overseen a worsening of that situation. The logic is ever the same. Demographer Paul Morland and economist Philip Pilkington's demographic trilemma model is very useful, limitations aside, for understanding why this is. Essentially, the idea is that a country can have two, but not three of the following: economic dynamism, ethnic continuity, and low birth rates, which they label egotism, selfishness. Morland and Pilkington provide the examples of Britain, which has economic growth and low fertility but is losing its ethnic continuity, Japan, which has ethnic continuity and low fertility but is economically stagnant, and Israel, which has ethnic continuity and economic growth but not low birth rates. We might quibble that Israeli economic dynamism relies on U.S. aid and support in various ways, but let's leave that aside. For its part, the Japanese model is risky, but for the West, the issue is also one of ideology. Our political class simply does not view ethnic continuity, by whatever name, as a good to be safeguarded at all. It isn't a positive category to them. There's really no reason to prefer the more long-term and difficult option of increasing fertility to the much faster and easier importation of foreign labor, if one does not view identity as something inherited and thinks social cohesion can just as soon be imposed from the top. So when discontent arises, one treats it as a problem of managing perceptions rather than a genuine grievance worthy of upending basic ideological assumptions and long-standing policy directions, which is what it would imply. Furthermore, foreign labor is economically advantageous for being cheap, politically advantageous to some political parties for providing votes, and managerially advantageous for reducing cultural cohesion and therefore limiting bottom-up collective action able to resist policy and social engineering. I've done videos about this before. Concerning that last angle, which I think is underemphasized, I've discussed the example of the Amazon-owned Whole Foods supermarket company suffering an email leak that revealed management was tracking various features of the workforce at different locations, concluding that the more diverse the body of employees at a given supermarket was, the less likely they were to unionize. More diversity, less bottom-up collective action, more top-down control. An older example is provided by Daryl Cooper of the Martyr Made History podcast, citing an interview with a coal mine operator from the early 20th century West Virginia.
One mine operator told a journalist that they'd purposely hired all different kinds of miners. They're pretty well mixed, and you bet your life we try to keep them mixed. As long as you've got them mixed, they cannot talk to one another so well, and it keeps them out of mischief. You can control them better when you got them mixed.
Crucially, from West Virginian coal mines over a century ago to contemporary supermarket chains, reducing organic inherited social cohesion and trust has to be accompanied by the imposition of new, simpler cohesion from the top. New cultural paradigms, made to measure for the political class or the managerial class's interests. A new people for a new politics, but that means keeping a lid on popular reactions, thus the need to provide escape valves. Unlike the creation of a company workforce, which can be hired from scratch, people will notice changes to an existing society and will resent it if it is too quick and too negative. Well, in much of the West, they have been too quick and too negative, and the political class is now focused on what to do about the reaction. And their strategy seems to be, as I've said, to accommodate it rhetorically more and more, but to repress it in actual fact. The point of keeping the demographic trilemma in mind is that such a reaction, when it comes, must do so with an alternative model. Moreland and Pilkington largely miss the social engineering dimension, as tends to be the case with economists and statisticians. They reduce complex phenomena to the causes their own discipline can measure. But all the same, their conclusion, I think, is spot on. Quote, "The more children model, which turns the country to the kind of normality we still see in much of the world and which prevailed in the UK in the 50s and 60s, is how they describe it. Our challenge is to make it happen in contemporary conditions," end quote. We need to break with the idea that there needs to be constant GDP growth, making provisions for the possibility that a population may contract in size, so long as it stabilizes later, and implement pro-natalist policies, spread pro-family culture, so that that stabilization and maybe subsequent growth does indeed take place. And the topic of pro-natalist policy that could actually work is a fascinating one that I think we would have to devote another video to at some point. Okay, thank you very much for watching. As always, please do subscribe if you would like to. That very much helps me out. And you can join me on Twitter. You can buy me a coffee. You can join me on Substack. You can become a paid member on Substack. That's one of the best ways to help me long term. And I do other content there too, essays and audio, etc. Until next time.